The states were united as never before. French Canadians and English-speaking Canadians had equal stakes in the invasion and were single-minded about the goal. Monsieur Land asked special permission of the House. Could the memoirs be sung? For the first time in Canadian parliamentary history, all the members joined in singing the memoirs, followed by God Save the King. In Columbus, Ohio, Mayor James R. H. ordered the air raid sirens and factory whistles sounded as a call to prayer. At 7:30 p.m., the entire city came to a complete stop for 5 minutes. Cars, buses, trucks and pedestrians halted and people prayed. As elsewhere, the Red Cross received a record blood donation, factory production was up and absenteeism was down. Churches were full. The Red Cross issued a call for every woman in Franklin County to immediately go to the surgical dressing unit in her community and was overwhelmed with volunteers. The Truck, Tractor and Equipment Company took out a full-page advertisement in the Columbus Star with the banner headline reading, "Next Stop, Berlin," and a brief text, "Today is a fitting day to ask ourselves, am I doing enough? If I met a man who was there, could I look him squarely in the face and say I did my share?" In Milwaukee, the Red Cross Blood Donor Center was overwhelmed by people wanting to give blood. In Reno, Nevada, the gambling dens closed, and only 16 couples filed for divorce, less than 10% of the usual weekday number. Elsewhere, an uglier side of American life was at work. In Cincinnati, 450 workers at the Wright Aeronautical Corporation went on strike over the transfer of 7 black workers into a shop formerly manned entirely by white personnel. William Green, president of the American Federation of Labor, called on American workers to consider themselves part of the invasion force and to stay at their jobs under any and all circumstances. In Birmingham, Alabama, the news reported that 1,500 miners at Republic Steel had gone out on a wildcat strike. The editors at the news were outraged, as were union officials. "Damn the strikers," said the president of the State American Federation of Labor. "To think that this great day should find AFL people away from their jobs is inconceivable." In Marietta, Georgia, police sirens and church bells began sounding at 3 a.m., and many citizens were hysterical. The Atlanta Constitution reported, wave after wave of sirens blasted their ears. Police cars, their sirens wide open, sped through the residential districts. Columnist Ralph Jones quoted his wife, whose remarks he felt were typical. "Our son was in England, possibly already in Normandy. Even if it meant I had to die, I should like to be a part of that invasion. It is the biggest and greatest and most spectacular thing in all history." After a pause, she added, "I just can't worry all the time about young Ralph. If I did, I'd go crazy. He's in no greater danger than hundreds of thousands of sons of other mothers." In Missoula, Montana, there was discussion everywhere, but the tremendous import of the news threw a hush over the spirit of the city, which was definitely noticeable. At the Veterans Hospital in Helena, one soldier on crutches exclaimed, "This is it, brother! We've got him on the run now!" Another called out from his bed, "Boy, do I wish I could be there!" There was a silence in the ward. "Yeah," the boy on crutches finally said without enthusiasm, "I'll bet that beach is like hell on the 4th of July." At Lawson General Hospital near Atlanta, wounded German prisoners of war took the news with derisive laughter and a just-you-wait attitude. One of them told a reporter, "The High Command will simply let the Allies penetrate a few miles and then pinch them off with the thousands of SS elite guards who are stationed near Paris." In Dallas, Texas, patriotism ran high. At 2:35 a.m., a hospital intern and a city ambulance driver helped Mrs. Lester Renfro give birth to a daughter. She heard the sirens and asked what was the cause. When told that the invasion had begun, she named her little girl Invasa May Renfro. In Norfolk, Virginia, Mrs. Randolph Edwards named her June 6th daughter D-Day Edwards. On June 4th, Molly Panther Downs reported in her letter from London for the New Yorker that everyone was existing merely from one ordinary day to the next, waiting for the great extraordinary one. Panther Downs noted an unexplainable rise in the rental of punts on the Thames and a record crowd at a cricket match at Lord's. She then turned to a phenomenon of the war in Britain that was always an irritant and sometimes costly: the prohibition on any weather news, either in the newspapers or over the radio. In May, frosts wiped out the famous vale of Evesham berry and plum crops. The fruit growers regretted that the official secrecy on weather conditions was not relaxed for once to give them a warning which might have helped save some of the fruit. The loss was serious for the British diet, made worse by a drought that had damaged the hay crop, resulting in less milk. The weather was the natural topic of conversation in a rural pub Panther Downs dropped in on. However, the one topic as much there as in London clubs and bars was the invasion. On June 6th, Panther Downs sensed something that other commentators missed. For the English, D-Day might well have stood for Dunkirk Day. The tremendous news that British soldiers were back on French soil suddenly revealed exactly how much it had rankled when they were seen off 4 years ago. There was no celebrating, far from it. The principal impression one got on the streets was that nobody was talking. Everybody seemed to be existing wholly in a preoccupied silence of his own. Everywhere, individual silences prevailed. Business was extremely bad. Taxi drivers said it was their worst day in months. Theatres and movie houses were half empty, all but unheard of in 1944. The pubs didn't fill either. Londoners stayed home. Everybody seemed to feel that this was one night you wanted your own thoughts in your own chair. In the countryside, everything was different now. Every truck on the road, every piece of gear on the railways, every jeep and half-track heading toward the front had become a thing of passionate concern. Farmers who wanted grey skies for their hay now wanted blue ones for the sake of their sons fighting in the skies and on the earth across the Channel. Women who gathered at train crossings where troops headed for the battle went by didn't know whether to wave or cheer or cry. Sometimes they did all three. King George VI made a D-Day broadcast to the nation. 4 years ago he began, "Our nation and empire stood alone against an overwhelming enemy with our backs to the wall. Now, once more, a supreme test has to be faced. This time the challenge is not to fight to survive, but to fight to win the final victory for the good cause." The king knew that nearly all his subjects were listening, and realized that the mothers and wives among them deserved special concern. "The Queen joins with me in sending you this message," he said. "She well understands the anxieties and care of our women folk at this time, and she knows that many of them will find, as she does herself, fresh strength and comfort in such waiting upon God." The king called on his subjects to pray at this historic moment. Surely not one of us is too busy, too young, or too old to play a part in a nationwide, perhaps a worldwide vigil of prayer as the great crusade sets forth. The House of Commons went about its business. The first question came from Mr. Hogg of Oxford. He asked the Secretary of State for War whether he could give an assurance that all ranks of the army had been informed that unless AFB 2626 was completed, they would not have a vote at the next general election, whether or not they were on the old register and on what scale AFB 2626 had been issued to units. The Secretary of State for War, Mr. John Grigg, replied at length that it was being done. Another member wanted to know if the Prime Minister would consider the complete restoration of the Abbey of Monte Cassino as a memorial to the heroes who had captured it, to be done at the expense of Germany as part of reparations. Labour leader Clement Attlee, a member of the Coalition War Cabinet, replied that it was premature to consider such proposals. The Secretary of State for the Colonies, Colonel Oliver Stanley, rose to remind the House that in many of the colonies there are large numbers of people who are condemned to live at an abysmal level of existence. The standard of living of the peoples in the colonial areas should be built up. Mr. Attlee, in replying to another question, switched the area for post-war concern from the colonies to the home front. He urged the composition and terms of reference of the proposed Royal Commission on the subject of equal pay between men and women. John Grigg made an unhappy announcement about men who had been overseas for 5 years or more. "I much regret that, owing to the shortage of men, it may be necessary, at any rate for the time being, to send such men overseas again after a period of 3 months in this country, instead of 6 months as hitherto. A member pressed the Secretary of the Treasury to ensure that members of the Association of Office Cleaners were referred to as such, instead of as charwomen or charades, which was resented by the 2,400 members of the association. The Secretary replied that the word cleaners would henceforth be used, as the mundane gave way to the silly and commons. The tension built. Rumours buzzed around about when the great man would appear on this his greatest day. Churchill sent word to expect him at noon. When Churchill entered Commons, every seat was taken, and every member was leaning forward expectantly. They were not so much expecting or even wanting to be swept away by Churchillian eloquence, as they were eager for whatever news the Prime Minister could tell them. The master toyed with his audience. Churchill began with Rome, clearly enjoying his old role of war reporter. Raymond Daniel wrote in the New York Times that Churchill went into 15 minutes of detail about how Rome was taken, followed by an analysis of the meaning of the event. It was all welcome news, the kind that Prime Ministers love to be in a position to tell the members. However, the members squirmed on their benches, eager to hear about the situation on the other side of the Channel. Finally, Churchill addressed the matter. I have also to announce to the House that during the night and early hours of the morning, the first of a series of landings in force upon the European continent has taken place. So far, the commanders report that everything is proceeding according to plan. He described the landings on the beaches at various points, noting that the fire of shore batteries had been largely quelled, and that obstacles encountered in the sea had not proved as difficult as was apprehended. He left to great cheers, but returned 4 hours later to add more detail. There is very much less loss than we expected. The many dangers and difficulties which at this time yesterday appeared extremely formidable are behind us. A very great risk had to be taken in respect to the weather, but General Eisenhower's courage is equal to all necessary decisions that have to be taken in these extremely difficult and uncontrollable matters. He referred to Major John Howard's operation at Pegasus Bridge and claimed that British troops had fought their way into the town of Carr, 9 miles inland. Churchill was fond of saying that the first casualty of war is truth. His rosy report fell at times into that category, but he was telling the truth when he described the airborne landings. As having taken place on a scale far larger than anything that has been seen so far in the world, for Edward R. Murrow in London, it was a day of frustration. CBS had put him in charge of coordinating the work of its many correspondents and reading the various announcements coming from Schaeff and others. He would have much rather been in France, contributing to his work. Radio correspondents had precious little to pass on to the States. Mobile transmitters were not set up on the beach or even on ships. Reporters who went into the beach in landing craft, including Bill Downes, Larry Luer and Charles Collingwood, could not broadcast. Finally, in the small hours of June 7th, 11 p.m. June 6th in New York, Murrow got what he wanted, a recording made at daybreak just off the French coast, sent back to London by small boat. "I think you'll like this," Murrow told New York as he put it on. It was George Hicks of ABC reporting from the Arnaud. He described the array of ships while, in the background, could be heard the exchanges between the German batteries and the Allied warships. That broadcast, cutting through the static and punctuated by the sounds of battle, became the most widely listened to account of the D-Day landings. In Paris, the military governor, General Stulpnagel, issued a proclamation broadcast by French radio. German troops had been given orders to shoot any person seen cooperating with the Allied invasion forces or who gave shelter to Allied soldiers, sailors or airmen. Such Frenchmen would be treated as bandits. Prime Minister Pierre Laval of the Vichy government broadcast a national appeal to his countrymen to ignore Eisenhower's call over the BBC for resistance. With sadness, he read the orders given to Frenchmen by an American general. The French government stands by the armistice of 1940 and appeals to Frenchmen to honour their country's signature. If you took part in the resistance fighting, France would be plunged into civil war. Marshal Pétain called on Frenchmen to stand with the Germans. The Anglo-Saxons have set foot on our soil. France is becoming a battlefield. Frenchmen do not attempt to commit any action which might bring terrible reprisals. Obey the orders of the government." Parisians listened and kept their own counsel. The country as a whole was quiet. Resistors went into action, of course, but most French people were not in the resistance. In Normandy and everywhere between Normandy and the German border, people were apprehensive about their village, farm, or city becoming a battlefield. They could hardly be sure who was going to win. The Germans were there among them, occupying their country, while the Allies were only a hope. They did the sensible thing, kept quiet and kept their thoughts to themselves. In the smaller cities in the south of France, people were more open with their feelings. Anthony Brooks of SOE walked into 2 at dawn. He knew from the BBC broadcasts that the hour had come and he was putting his operation into action. But only he and other resistors knew that this was D-Day. So I walked into 2, through the market garden area, and there were all these little one-story houses and these enormous great stretches with lettuces and onions, and they were thinning them out like a painting. Suddenly, as I was walking past a house just after sunrise, shutters were flung open, and a little girl, I suppose 8 years old, stark naked, shouted in the local jargon, "They've landed!" and the liberation of Europe had begun. Brooks went to a meeting in 2, where we lifted our glass for a very early morning drink, white wine, because we never really believed that we would see it. I mean liberation. I couldn't believe when I was parachuted into France in 1942 that I'd ever see D-Day. One famous American expatriate, who was a French resident, wrote down her feelings and perceptions of the effect on the Germans in 1940. Gertrude Stein had fled Paris when the Germans entered. "They all said leave," Stein wrote in 1945, and I said to Alice too, "Well, I don't know, it would be awfully uncomfortable and I am fussy about my food." But they went. Stein and Alice Toklas lived in the village of Belly at the corner made by Italy and Switzerland. Stein's attitude was that Alice Toklas could listen to the wireless, but as for her, she was going to cut box hedges and forget the war. Of course, she could not. On June 5, 1944, she wrote, "Tonight Rome is taken. It is a pleasure and such a pleasure, and it has taken everybody's mind a little off their feelings about the Allied bombardments in France, about the civilians killed. But tonight Rome is taken, and everybody has forgotten the bombardments. For the French to forgive and forget is very easy, just as easy as that. Rome is taken, and it is not the end, but the beginning of the end." Stein went walking on the morning of June 6th to celebrate. She passed some German soldiers, and they said most pitifully, "How do you do?" I naturally said nothing. Later on, I was sitting with the wife of the mayor in front of her house. A German soldier passed along the road, and he politely bowed to us and said, "How do you do?" They have never done this before. Well, today is the landing, and we heard Eisenhower tell us he was here. They were here. And just yesterday a man sold us 10 packages of Camel cigarettes. Glory be, and we are singing Glory Hallelujah, and feeling very nicely. Everybody has been telephoning us congratulatory messages upon my birthday, which it isn't, but we know what they mean. And I said in return I hoped their hair was curling nicely, and we all hope it is. And today is the day. In Rome, a celebration was already underway when the news came. The celebration just got bigger. Daniel Lang, in his letter from Rome, reported to the New Yorker that the Italians were ecstatic. They love a winner just a little more than the rest of the world does, and they were out by the thousands, jamming the square on which Mussolini used to stage his pep rallies. They cheered and applauded as though they were watching the best opera of their lives. They shouted whatever scraps of English they knew. One wild old man yelled, "Weekend! Weekend!" over and over again. Many had huge bouquets of flowers from which they kept plucking small bunches to toss at soldiers in jeeps and lorries or at tank drivers. Dozens of people were waving British, French and American flags where they had been hidden. In Amsterdam, Anne Frank heard the news over the wireless in her attic hideaway. "This is D-Day. came the announcement over the English news. She wrote in her diary, then in English, "This is the day." She went on, "The invasion has begun. The English gave the news. We discussed it over breakfast at 9 o'clock. Is this just a trial landing like Dieppe 2 years ago? But through the day, confirmations that this was really it kept coming on the wireless. Great commotion in the secret annex," Frank wrote. "It still seems too wonderful, too much like a fairy tale. Could we be granted victory this year, 1944? We don't know yet, but hope is revived within us. It gives us fresh courage and makes us strong again. Now, more than ever, we must clench our teeth and not cry out. France, Russia, Italy and Germany too can all cry out and give vent to their misery. But we haven't the right to do that yet. The best part of the invasion is that I have the feeling that friends are approaching. We have been oppressed by those terrible Germans for so long. They have had their knives so at our throats that the thought of friends and deliverance fills us with confidence. Now it doesn't concern the Jews anymore. No, it concerns Holland and all occupied Europe. Perhaps, Margot says, I may yet be able to go back to school in September or October." In Moscow, the crowds were joyous. People literally danced in the streets. Time reported, and its correspondent claimed that this was the happiest capital. In the lobby of the Metropole Hotel, an ecstatic Muscovite threw her arms around the correspondent and exclaimed, "We love you, Americans! We love you! We love you! You are our real friends!" Restaurants were packed in Moscow on the evening of June 6th, packed with people celebrating, Russians dancing with British and American diplomats and reporters. Alexander W.T.H. was at one such gathering when a party of Dokling-Tsenk diplomats and journalists came in and behaved and danced provocatively and ostentatiously, and were nearly beaten up by some Americans. Pravda gave the invasion news 4 columns with a large photograph of Eisenhower, but made no comment on the significance. The editors had to wait for Stalin to give his line. Not for a week did the dictator speak about the realization of that second front for which he had so long been pleading. When he did, he was generous and forthright. This is unquestionably a brilliant success for our allies. One must admit that the history of wars does not know of an undertaking comparable to it for breadth of conception, grandeur of scale, and mastery of execution. He pointed out that invincible Napoleon had not managed to cross the Channel, nor had Hitler. Only the British and American troops succeeded in forcing the Channel. History will record this action as an achievement of the highest order. After that statement, Pravda was enthusiastic about the achievement. In Berlin, people went quietly about their duties. Few talked of the invasion, although the radio was full of announcements. The Nazi propaganda line was, "Thank God the intense strain of the nerve war is over." But the Times correspondent in Stockholm reported that the scale of General Eisenhower's first blow made a deep impression on the general public in Berlin, especially as the German spokesman emphasized its magnitude and disconcertingly added that it was not yet certain whether this was the main invasion force. Mainly, though, the Nazi broadcasters went to work to convince people that it was necessary for them to fight against the British and Americans in France in order to save Germany from the horror of a Red Army occupation. In a totalitarian state, it was impossible to tell how many, if any, other than Hitler and his henchmen believed such lies. Lieutenant George Honor, Royal Navy Reserves, was the skipper of X-23, a submarine 7 meters in length with a crew of 4. Along with the skipper of X-20, Honor had a unique view of the invasion at first light. At first he was anchored a couple of kilometers off Wyam Sword Beach. X-20 was off Juno. The submarines were between the invaders and defenders in no man's water. X-23 and X-20 were there because of the requirements of the DD tanks. There were only narrow strips where the swimming tanks, which would lead the invasion, could climb up the beaches. The submarines would serve as their guides so they could land bang on target. The British tanks, Churchills and Shermans, were equipped for a variety of tasks. There were flail tanks with drums out front that carried chains to lash the ground as the drums turned, powered by their own small engines, and set off mines safely in front of the tank. There were tanks carrying fascine for getting over anti-tank ditches and drainage ditches, and others that carried heavy bridging equipment for crossing larger gaps. To accommodate some of the special equipment, the 75mm cannon on the tanks had been replaced by little snub-nosed heavy mortars. These mortars could hurl 25 Lelby high explosive charges over a short distance, less than 50 ms, to blast holes in cement walls and blockhouses. Other tanks dragged 400-gallon trailers of fuel that could shoot a high-pressure jet of flame over a range of 100 metres. Captain Hampton of the 79th Armoured Division had been introduced to Hobart's funnies by their inventor, Major General Percy Hobart, at the Oxford training area in East Anglia. General Hobart gathered everybody around and said, "I have some news for you. You have heard of the Lord Mayor's show, and everybody's heart stopped beating. And you know about the people who come afterwards to clear up the mess. Well, your job is going to be the very opposite. You're going in front to clear up the mess. You are going to be line clearers." Flails, hammer-ons, and other experimental devices were in use. They were experimenting with flails, snakes, scorpions, and other strange contraptions. They had bull's horn ploughs fitted to the front of the Churchills to carve an enormous furrow, turning any mines over the side. The snake was a flexible and the serpent a rigid tube. The snake was fired from a harpoon gun and pumped full of nitroglycerin. The serpent was pushed in front of a tank stuffed with high explosives. When detonated, they would set off the mines. The snub-nosed tanks had extra lugs welded onto the body with heavy tow ropes fixed beside them. The purpose was to drag obstacles out of the way or to move disabled vehicles. The tanks, called Mark 8 Avaris, provided a loading platform for extra gear. Major Kenneth Ferguson of the British 3rd Division commanded an assault squadron of Hobart's funnies at Sword Beach. He recalled loading onto an LCT, landing craft tank, his unit, which contained 2 flail tanks, a tank carrying a 30-foot metal bridge folded in half and sticking straight up in the air in front of the tank, and a tank carrying log carpets, 2 drums nearly as large as the tank itself, attached one over the other to lay down matting over the sand. The flails would go first, then the bridge to provide a way over the seawall, and finally the carpet layer to make a road surface for the fighting tanks. DD tanks would precede them, setting up at the waterline and blasting fortified positions. As Ferguson finished overseeing the loading of his funnies, one of the seamen called out, "Oh, sir, I say, you've forgotten the piano." Ferguson wanted personal mobility once he got ashore, so he loaded a motorcycle and a bicycle on top of his AV. Thousands of British troops took bicycles with them. There is no record of any American doing so, although the 1100 First Commander tried, but his men threw it out over the channel. Captain Cyril James Henry commanded a troop of funnies during the crossing. The skipper of the LCT said to him, "Your bridge is acting as a sail. Can you lower it a bit?" Henry unfolded the bridge so that the far end rested on the tank in front, which helped. The British counted heavily on these specialised tanks to help them get ashore and break through the first line of defences. They were a bit put off by the American refusal to use their inventions, except for the DD tank concept, which the British insisted the Americans butchered by launching from too far out. Some British officers wondered if there was a touch of hurt pride involved. It would be rather nice if the Yanks would utilise British brains to guide American brawn. But the Americans insisted they would do the job with their own equipment. At Utah, the Americans had been right, although they could have used flail tanks. Overall, the armoured units performed well, not as cumbersome or slow as the overloaded British specialised tanks. They sped inland and participated in important actions, achieving most D-Day objectives at Utah. At Omaha, British specialised tanks would have had no function in overcoming the first problem, getting through the shingle of the beaches. Only Omaha had a shingle so high and slippery it was impossible for a tank to cross. Once some gaps were blown, the American tankers could have put some of the British gadgets to good use, especially the fascine and bridging equipment. But the Yanks had bulldozers for that work, which was completed in time for a few tanks to make it to the plateau before dark. It would be too large a generalization to say that the British wanted to fight World War II with gadgets, techniques, and espionage rather than men, to outthink rather than outfight the Germans. Similarly, the Americans were seen as wanting to fight head-to-head with the Germans. Many people from both countries felt such generalizations had merit. Connected to that feeling was the British sense that the Americans took needless casualties because of their aggressive head-on mentality, and the American sense that the British would take needless casualties due to their caution and refusal to press an attack home regardless of loss, which could prolong the war. Whatever measure of truth there was in those widely held perceptions, it is certain that on D-Day the British used far more gadgets than the Americans. Lieutenant Honor recalled of X-23, "The submarine had a diesel engine and an electric motor, 2 bunks, a toilet, the escape hatch, a cooker, electronic equipment to send out signals, and oxygen bottles taken from LT Wuffer planes shot down over England, as they were the lightest bottles available in Britain." More so. "We had all these wretched gadgets," Honor said, "and the worst was the wretched mast. It was 18 feet in length and had to be lashed to special stanchions on the shell of the submarine. It folded miserably. The code name for this operation was Gambit. Honor was not a chess player, so he looked the word up in the dictionary and was a bit set back to read, 'throwing away the opening pawns.' Gambit required a special kind of man. Everyone on the submarine had to be able to do every job, handle all machinery and electronic gear, navigate, dive, and much more. They also had to handle being cooped in an enclosed boat, hardly bigger than a canoe, for 40 hours or more. Some volunteers found in their trials that they couldn't take 1 hour of it. "Let me out," one man cried after 45 minutes. With 5 men on board, the extra was a seaman who was going to take a rubber raft toward the shore, anchor, and provide a final marker for the DD tanks. X-23 and X-20 set off at 6 p.m. on Friday night, June 2nd. 2 trawlers escorted them past the Isle of Wight. At that point they dove and set off for their destinations, X-23 at Sword and X-20 at Juno. On Sunday morning, June 4th, just before dawn, X-23 came up for air. "We had hit it right on the nose. We were right where we should have been," Honor recalled. He took a quick look around. To his surprise, the Germans had a light turned on to mark the entrance to the Orne River. As dawn began to break, he submerged to periscope depth and checked out the church steeples and other landmarks to make doubly sure he was on target. There was a cow grazing on the shore, Honor remembered. He took the submarine down to the bottom of the channel, dropped anchor, and waited. At midday on Sunday, Honor came back to periscope depth to see what was going on. There were loads of Germans coming down to the beach, playing beach ball and swimming. They were having their Sunday make-up, and men were coming down in loads, having a lovely time. Little do they know, Honor thought, before going back to the bottom for more waiting. At midnight, with the radio turned on for coded messages, one came in the clear by voice message from the Isle of Wight. "Your aunt is riding a bicycle today." That meant the invasion had been postponed for 1 day, back to the bottom for an additional 24 hours of waiting. It was cold, wet, stuffy, and cramped inside the submarine. Honor and his crew fiddled around with the gyroscope to give them something to do. They worried about the oxygen. No one knew how long the air in the bottles would last. They played poker and tried to sleep in shifts on the 2 bunks. They could not smoke cigarettes, which was a real deprivation. The gyroscope was fixed, and there was nothing to do. We didn't like this 24-hour bit. Honor declared they didn't know about the oxygen, how these damned bottles were getting on, whether they were half empty or nearly empty. When the submarines came to the surface at midnight on June 5th and 6th, there was no postponement message. After recharging the batteries, they went back to the bottom at 5 a.m. on D-Day. Back to the top, swinging on the anchor, the weather was miserable. The wind in the channel was making 1 to 3 metre swells. There was no possibility of launching the rubber boat. There was some question whether they could get the master properly mounted. Waves were breaking over the submarine. It was slippery and pitching in the waves. Those below were handing up tools and equipment. "What the hell's this?" those on top would inquire. X-23 completed the job at about 5:20 a.m. and immediately began sending out radio signals and flashing the green light from the top of the mast. Green meant they were on station. Red would have meant they were off station. They turned on the radio underneath the boat. Honor described it as a dreadful thing that sent out an underwater ping. The ping could be picked up by sonar, thus marking the spot. The light was coming up. Lieutenant Honor looked out to sea, and gradually in the distance you could make out the bigger ships and then the smaller ones, the destroyers. Then all hell broke loose over X-23. 14-inch shells from the battleships and 5-inch shells from the destroyers hit the shore. Bombers and fighters were hitting the beach. "I was standing quietly watching all this," Honor said, when suddenly my cap was whisked off by one of those LCTs firing about 1,000 rockets. Then came the DD tanks. These poor wretched tanks, Honor called them. They poured off those LCTs, and they had twin screws. They set off and made a line abreast. One tank started going round and round. Apparently it had bent a screw. It started taking water and went down. The chaps came up, Honor said. They got out just like in a submarine, one hatch. The remainder of the tanks headed towards shore. As they passed us, Honor noted, we cheered them and they cheered us. That was our job done. Then Honor's orders were to rendezvous with his trawler and return to England. Fearful that his little boat might get smashed by an LCT or LCM, he tied a large white sheet to the mast and went out on the surface toward the transport area. As far as the eye could see, there were landing craft, either the small ones or the tank landing craft, all along. People were going ashore from them and the bigger landing ships. You could see the little landing craft being lowered and leaving the sides, and everybody going onto the shore. It was a hive of activity everywhere you looked. Honor made it back to England and went on to other adventures in the war. Asked 47 years later if he had ever discovered how much oxygen he had left, he replied, "No, we never knew at all. Didn't much care, thanks to X-20 and X-23. The DD tanks were on target, but they were too slow and cumbersome to fight the combined effects of wind, swells and tidal currents. They were scheduled to hit the beach first to bring suppressing fire to bear immediately. But as they slowly made their way toward shore, the LCTs bearing the specialized tanks began to pass them. Major Kenneth Ferguson remembered as his LCT passed the DD tanks. I realized they weren't going to be there. There was a 30 kilometers stretch of sandy beach stretching from Wareham at the mouth of the Orne River to Aramoni, where there was a small fishing harbour. Here and there a cliff jutted out to sea. Between Lucormer and Leonceau, there was a stretch of about a kilometre where the cliff was sheer and 10 metres high, clearly unsuitable for an invasion. But most of the remainder was suitable until just east of Aramoni, where the tableland rose and the cliffs ran straight down to the sea. At a height of 30 metres, the Germans had put a W. Berg radar installation on top of the cliff, but Allied bombers had knocked it out in May. To the west of the opening, at the tiny port of Arenes, the cliffs rose sheer again and ran on for another 12 kilometres to Fox Red, the eastern edge of Omaha Beach. Gold, Juneau and Sword beaches were similar to Utah in that they all had a gradual, almost imperceptible rise in land. In all 4 cases, there was no high ground at the foot of the beach to overcome, no one shooting down on them. But the British beaches differed from Utah in several ways. They were far more built up with seaside resorts and homes. The British infantry would have to root out the enemy in street-to-street fighting. The British beaches were not so extensively flooded as Utah, and the British had a more extensive road system available. They had a major objective, according to General Montgomery, which was to capture Caen, a city of critical importance to the Germans, far more than Charente or Bayeux. It opened the direct route to Paris. The Germans would be certain to rush armoured reinforcements to Caen as soon as possible. Montgomery wanted to seize the city as part of the opening shock and surprise. He wanted to get Caen before the Germans could get their armour there. The airmen were pushing for Caen too. They wanted to set up a forward base at the well-developed Carpiquet airfield just west of Caen and get started on D-Day. It was 6 weeks before these objectives were realized, and it only happened then because the Americans had broken out on the western flank and were threatening to envelop Caen. Montgomery later claimed that it had always been his intention to hold on his left at Caen and break out on his right at Saint-Lô. There is an overlong historical controversy about this claim. It generally breaks down along nationalistic lines. Most British historians back Monty, while all American historians say Monty's claim was false, a cover-up. It is not necessary to go into the details, as there is already far too much written about it. It is not possible to go into Montgomery's heart to see what he really intended, but it is possible to observe his actions. We know what he said to others. What Montgomery said was that Caen was critical and that he would have it by the end of D-Day. To get Caen, the British had made their major commitment. The 6 airborne divisions landed east of the River Orne to prevent German tanks from getting to Caen. John Howard's Ox and Bucks had landed at Pegasus Bridge to open that crossroads for the inland push on Caen. The commandos were put into the operation. The British official historian later concluded that the D-Day objectives were perhaps over-ambitious, namely the capture of Bayeux and the road to Saint-Lô, the seizure of Caen itself, and the safeguarding of the Allies' left flank with a bridgehead east of the Orne. Caen is 8 miles from the coast and Bayeux 6 or 7 miles. There was no possibility of taking them that day unless the advance was made as rapidly as possible. Montgomery promised that the British would advance rapidly. At the final briefing at St. Paul's on May 15th, he had said he would get well inland on D-Day and crack about and force the battle to swing our way. He said it was possible he would get to Falaise, 50 kilometres inland, on the first day. He intended to send armoured columns quickly toward Caen, which would upset the enemy's plans and tend to hold him off while they built up strength. "We must gain space rapidly and seize Caen," he said. He intended to take Caen the first day, break through the German lines, and drive along the coast toward the Seine River. Those were heavy commitments. To take them on required confidence and optimism. The optimism especially ran high in late May. Intelligence reported the presence of the 21st Panzer Division around Caen, with a regiment on each side of the Orne. Montgomery's headquarters decided to keep the information from the troops. John Howard and his men were not informed, nor were they given adequate anti-tank weapons. Not only did British headquarters suppress information that could have been invaluable to men going into battle for fear of dampening their morale, shades of World War I, headquarters made no positive use of the quite accurate intelligence about the position of the 21st Panzer. The official historian of British intelligence in World War II wrote, "There is no indication in the surviving evidence that the information prompted any consideration of the need to revise and strengthen the British plans for the capture of Caen. Despite strong warnings from the intelligence authorities, they proceeded without bargaining for the possibility that 21st Panzer might be widely deployed around Caen. The reason given was that it was too late to change the plans. But during those same final days, the US 82nd Airborne changed its drop zone based on the latest intelligence on German positions in the Cotentin. British intelligence had a similar break in September 1944, just before the airborne landings at Arnhem in Operation Market Garden, and again was frustrated when Montgomery refused to use the intelligence. The British were outstanding in gathering intelligence, but lousy in using it. The obstacles on the British beaches were similar to those at Utah. The inland defences varied considerably because the battlefield was so different. At Gold, Juno and Sword, once men and vehicles were over the seawall and across the anti-tank ditch, they were in paved village streets. Once through 2 or 3 blocks, they were out in the wheat fields, large fields. The terrain between Westrup and Caen is flat and mainly free of hedgerows. To prevent a British breakout into the open ground, the Germans had built some formidable defences at Rivella, a village just west of Wiam. There was an emplacement with 22 pieces of all types, including 12 155mm cannons. At Holgate, about 10 kilometres from Sword's left flank, there was a battery with 6 155mm guns. Even closer, at Merville, there were 4 75mm guns. At Long's, halfway between Omaha and Gold Beaches, the German battery consisted of 4 155mm guns set back about a kilometre from the coast, with a steel-reinforced concrete observation post right on the edge of the cliff and able to communicate with the batteries by underground telephone line. Scattered along the beach were extensive implementation of placements held 75s, 88s, mortars and machine guns as always. The embrasures opened along the beach, not out to sea, and the concrete was much too thick and too well reinforced to be vulnerable to even the largest naval shell. Such positions would have to be taken by infantry. In the dunes, the Germans had some Tobruk's, but not nearly so many as at Omaha, nor were the infantry trenches so extensive. The commander of the German 716th Infantry Division was General Lieutenant Wilhelm Roar. He was responsible for the defence of the British beaches and was pessimistic about his chances to hold against a serious invasion. More than a third of his men were from OST battalions, primarily from Soviet Georgia and Russia. One General Staff officer remarked in a May report, "We are asking rather a lot if we expect Russians to fight in France for Germany against the Americans." Roar's strongpoints and resistance nests were spaced about 800 metres apart, in some places more than a kilometre apart. Roar commented that they were beaded along the coast like a string of pearls. There was no depth to the position whatsoever for reinforcement. Roar had to rely on the 21st Panzer, 12 kilometres away, and paralysed by Hitler's orders, or the 12th Panzer Division, which had one regiment north of K, some 20 kilometres away. The British attack on General ROR's 716th Division began shortly after midnight with a bombing raid along the coast. In this part of the Calvados coast, the population was considerably denser than at Omaha or Utah, and French civilians suffered badly. Emercel Jong, who lived in the seaside village of Saint-Comdine at the western tip of the British invasion, kept a diary. "I was awakened this morning at 1 a.m. by a distant bombardment. We got dressed, heard the big bombers coming in, and constantly passing over our heads. My parents and I stayed in the corner where the walls were thickest. At dawn, suddenly a big gun fired from the sea, and the smaller cannons of the Boche were answering. Everything in the house, doors, windows, and everything in the loft, seemed to be dancing. We had the impression that all sorts of things were falling in the courtyard. We were not feeling very brave. Madame d'Anselme lived in Anel, a village off Gold Beach. The Germans had a gun emplacement at the bottom of her garden. Madame d'Anselme had 7 children and had dug a trench in her garden just big enough to shelter the 8 of them and a couple of others. She said when the bombing began, she hurried her little troop into the trench and they stayed until dawn. One of the boys seized the opportunity of a lull when the bombing lifted to climb the garden wall to see what was happening. "Mummy," he called out, "look at the sea! It's black with boats!" The UDT, Underwater Demolition Team. Men and the Royal Engineers began to touch down on Gold Beach at 7:35 a.m., followed immediately by the first wave of LCTs carrying tanks and LCAs bringing in infantry assault teams. It was an hour later than the American landings because the tide moved from west to east, and low tide came later on the British beaches. But the wind at Gold was coming almost straight in from the northwest, piling up the water to such a depth that the outer line of obstacles was underwater before the UDT men could get to them. The later time of the attack was fortunate in that it gave the bombers and battleships longer to work over the beach defences. Many of the Germans were in the resort houses that dotted the coast, concentrated at Lamel, right centre of Gold Beach, and La Riviere, left flank boundary with Juno Beach. Unlike the concrete emplacements, the houses could be set on fire by naval shells and air-dropped bombs. The official British Observer described the initial action just as it was getting light. A tremendous bombing attack was delivered inland, and fires which appeared to come from Vert and La Riviere could be clearly seen. Apart from some flak, there was no enemy opposition of any sort. Although it was broad daylight and the ships must have been clearly visible from the beaches, it was not until the first flight of assaulting troops was away, and the cruiser HMS Belfast opened fire, that the enemy appeared to realise that something out of the ordinary was afoot. For some time after this, the anchorage was ineffectually shelled by the enemy. Coastal battery situated about 3/4 of a mile inland. Shooting was very desultory and inaccurate, and the guns were only 6 to 8 inches in calibre. Lieutenant Pat Blamey's LCT moved towards shore, with shells from naval guns ranging from 5 inches to 14 inches whistling overhead. Blamey commanded a Sherman tank with a 25-pounder cannon mounted on it. Behind him in the LCT were 4 25-pounder field artillery pieces that he would be towing ashore. The battery commenced firing when it was 12 kilometres from shore and continued to fire a steady 3 rounds per minute until down to 3 kilometres. This was a period of furious activity. Blamey remembered, "Ammo boxes and shell cases jettisoned overboard as I called out the ranges received from the control craft. The noise was terrific, but nothing compared with the blast from the rocket ships when they opened up. As our assault craft closed the beach obstacles proved to be more dangerous than German infantry or artillery. German snipers concentrated their fire on UDT teams, so that almost no clearing of lanes had been completed. LCTs landed first near Isles, where they disorganised 2 companies of Hobart's Funnies. 20 of the LCTs hit mined obstacles, suffering moderate to severe damage, losing some tanks and men. The torpedoes' full-speed-ahead approach by the LCTs was in accord with the rules for guidance handed out to the coxswains by the Royal Navy. Hedgehogs, stakes, or tetrahedra will not prevent your beaching, provided you go flat out. Those instructions read, "Your craft will crunch over them, bend them, and squash them into the sand, and the damage to your outer bottom can be accepted, so drive on." Element C, however, is an obstacle to LCTs, but at full speed you can bend them and pass partially over them. Therefore avoid element C if you can. If you cannot, try and hit it at a glancing blow, preferably near the end of a bay. This will probably turn it or drive its supports into the sand. A second blow may enable you to squeeze through or past it. Do not worry too much about how you are to get out again. The first and primary object is to get in and land without drowning the vehicles. Once the ramp went down, the men and vehicles rushed off the craft. A commando explained, "The reason we stormed Normandy like we did was because the soldiers would rather have fought the whole German army than go back on the ships and be as seasick as they were going over. My God, those soldiers couldn't wait to get on dry land. Nothing would have got in their way. They would have torn tanks to pieces with their bare hands. They didn't have to because there were no German tanks on the beach. Even the infantry resistance was ineffective." When Blamey drove off his LCT towing the artillery pieces, he found that local strongpoints had been neutralised by the bombardment. Shelling and mortaring from inland were slight and inaccurate. Except for some dozen jerrys, the beach was deserted of enemy. The ones I saw were completely shattered by the bombardment. They appeared to be Mongolians to Blamey. It seemed like an ordinary exercise. The only difference was with the LCTs blowing up on the beach obstacles and swinging about. He went to work laying out the line for his guns, putting up flags where he wanted the 25-pounders to position themselves. The British landed some 200 of these excellent anti-tank guns on D-Day, a much better record than the American artillery achieved. "One wasn't conscious of being in the middle of a hurly-burly," Blamey said. "Everything was very well ordered. Things were arriving, being unloaded. All those nice little French villas just inland had been set on fire, and almost all were destroyed. I was more frightened of making a mess of my job and letting the side down than anything else." Asked if the organisation was better than he had expected, Blamey replied it was absolutely like clockwork. "We knew it would be. We had every confidence. We had rehearsed it so often. We knew our equipment. We knew it worked. We knew, given reasonable conditions, we would get off the craft." He gave credit to the Navy and the RAF. In his opinion, they made their landing a pushover. As the second wave began to arrive and the tide reduced the width of the beach, Blamey had his gunners cease fire and prepare to move inland. He hooked the pieces up to his tank and drove to the outskirts of Anel, where he stopped to brew some tea before proceeding on to just west of Mouan, where he began to take fire from German 88s on a ridge ahead. Blamey lined up his cannon and replied. Soon enough, the German fire was silenced. The sectors at Gold were from west to east: Item, Jig, King, and Love. The attackers from the north, Umbrian 50th Division, were the Devire Hampshire, Dorsetshire, and East Yorkshire regiments, accompanied by the Green Howards and Durham Light Infantry, plus engineer, communication, and artillery units, followed by the 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats. Blamey had landed at Jig. Seaman Ronald Seaborne, a forward observer for the Belfast, landed to his left at Love. Everyone on Seaborne's LCM was seasick. We had had a fried egg breakfast washed down by a tot of rum, not my choice, but mandatory for all those going ashore. The LCM ran aground 200 metres or more from the waterline, but Seaborne, carrying his radio, was as eager as everyone else to run down the ramp and into the water, anything to abandon that instrument of torture. LCAs passed Seaborne as he struggled through the chest-deep water. By the time he was on the beach, there were 200 or so troops already there, effectively dealing with the straggling rifle fire coming from the defences of La Riviere. After the bombardment, Seaborne was surprised that any Germans were still alive, much less firing back. Seaborne's party consisted of a Royal Artillery captain, a bombardier, and a leading telegraphist. They crossed the seawall and the coastal road. The captain told Seaborne to report to Belfast that the beachhead was secure and that the party was going inland. Seaborne began hiking toward Crepon. After a quarter of an hour of frustration trying to raise Belfast, he decided to follow the captain. As he walked along a lane in the direction of Crepon, he could not see another person. Suddenly, from a field ahead, 3 men in German uniforms emerged. He thought this was the end of the war for him, but they raised their hands above their heads. Through a mixture of French, German, and English, he learned that they were Russians. He pointed the way to the beach and proceeded on. Before long, he came to a small church. After halfway through the graveyard, a shot whistled by him. He dropped to the ground amid a mass of poppies, then moved slowly toward a stone tombstone for safer shelter. Another shot rang out. He hid behind the tombstone, peered around it, and spotted a German helmet. He fired back, and for the next few minutes it was real cowboy and Indian stuff. With the last of his ammunition, he got a lucky ricochet on his enemy, who slumped from his hiding place into full view. Seaborne went over and looked at him and found he was gazing at a young boy, presumably one of the Hitler Youth. He felt sick, sicker even than he had been on the LCM an hour or so previously. Lieutenant Commander Brian Toler Winnie of the Royal Navy was the beachmaster for Item and Jig sectors. He landed at 7:45 a.m., some 150 metres from the waterline. On the way in, considerable fire developed on the beaches and offshore from enemy batteries inland and mortars. Many near misses were observed among the LCAs of the assault wave. Winnie made his way to the sea wall, where he became aware of a group of about a dozen men sitting quite quietly, apparently gazing out to sea. It took a few seconds for him to realize that they were the Germans who had been manning the beach defences. They were waiting to surrender. Further east, at Lamel, the German troops were sticking to their guns. One machine gun in a pillbox was firing with great effect, supported by mortar rounds dropping onto the shrinking beach. All tanks on the beach had been put out of action, either by mined obstacles or mortar shells. Without tanks, the engineers had been unable to clear any exits in the sector. The Germans in Lamel, from the 1st Battalion, 916th Regiment, part of the 352nd Division, were somewhat protected in brick houses and hotels, and they maintained a steady fire onto the beach. Winnie decided to suspend landing opposite Lamel and diverted follow-up waves to his right and left, where the opposition was less and exits had been opened. Beach obstacles in front of La Hamblin were significant, as no landing craft were able to beach due to the heavy surf and enemy fire. The risk to personnel was too great. Winnie went to the top of the seawall, where he took cover behind a disabled tank. Other men joined him. The disabled tank was a great boon, as it provided a narrow cone of shelter from the fire from the pillbox. Without it, they would have been in much worse trouble. The only tank to get off their beach successfully was a flail tank, which deafened everyone by blowing off its waterproofing before proceeding inland to support the Marine commandos. Winnie and his party were soon joined by an improbable comrade. A Fleet Air Arms small plane, piloted by a Royal Navy lieutenant commander, was shot down by his own ship while reporting to it. The pilot managed to eject and parachute safely into the surf. They met him as he staggered ashore. He was almost speechless with rage, demanding a boat forthwith. He was the angriest man Winnie had ever seen, and he didn't envy the gun crew responsible for his ditching. The next day there was a somewhat similar incident at Omaha. Private Joseph Barrett, from the 474th Anti-Aircraft Artillery, witnessed a P-51 come out of the clouds down low. The 474th shot it down, and the pilot, a lieutenant, parachuted onto the beach. He was wearing his Class A uniform and carrying a bottle of whiskey. He said he had a date in London that night and was only supposed to make a single pass over the beach. He was furious, but Barrett noted that they had been instructed to shoot at anything lower than 1,000 feet, except at La Rivière, which held out until 10 a.m., and Le Hamblin, which held out until mid-afternoon. The German defences on Gold Beach were incapable of stopping the advance of men and vehicles from the 50th Division, nor were there hedgerows inland to check their momentum. The Germans relied on their counter-attack capability. Camp Grotte-Ramaya, stationed near Bayeux, had practiced manoeuvres for rapid beach landings. However, at 4 a.m. on June 6th, the regiment went off on a wild goose chase to attack reported large-scale enemy airborne landings near Ayeni. At 8 a.m., General CCE realized his mistake and ordered a countermarch back to the Bayou area for a counterattack toward Capon. It took an hour for the order to reach the regiment, which then had to march about 30 kilometers to reach its start point. The march was made partly on foot, partly by bicycle, and partly by French trucks that kept breaking down. It consumed another 5 hours before the lead elements approached the assembly position. Thus, C's main reserve spent the critical hours of D-Day marching across the countryside, first this way, then that. While the 95th Division was marching east, it lost one of its 3 battalions as CCE split the 2nd Battalion off and sent it to Seville to meet the threat from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. When the body of C. Grouper Meyer passing south of Bayeux reached the Brazenville assembly area at 5:30 p.m., the British were already in possession of Brazenville. Instead of attacking, Camp Grère-Mere was thrown on the defensive. Colonel Mere was killed, and there was no counterattack at Gold Beach. However, Camp Grère-Mere served a purpose for the Germans. The opposition it put up at Brazenville checked the advance of the 50th Division. Due to the unusually high tide and the delay in clearing the beach obstacles, the follow-up waves from the division were 2 hours or more late in getting ashore. The road to Bayeux was open until 5:30 p.m., but the British were too late to take advantage of the opportunity. Still, they managed to reach Brazenville in time to check Mere, and were in a position to move out to Bayeux the following day. The pattern was repeated across the British and Canadian beaches. The assault teams crossed the beach and penetrated the German defence system with relatively little difficulty, but follow-up waves were delayed by the high tide and beach obstacles. Inland, the assault teams failed to advance as quickly or as far as Montgomery had hoped. The tendency was to stop, brew up some tea, and congratulate themselves on accomplishing their objective. When they moved out in the afternoon, they did so cautiously, relying on their artillery or Hobart's funnies to subdue the opposition. There were tanks and artillery opposing the advance, and the Germans were rushing reinforcements to the area, which was far more critical to them than anything on the American front. Bayeux sat astride the N13, the highway running from Caen to Sherborne, while Quay was the gateway to Paris to the east. The adventures of Seaman Seaborne during the day illustrate, in microcosm, the British problems after clearing the beach. After his firefight with the German sniper in the graveyard, Seaborne hurried to catch up with the captain of his forward observation team. When he arrived, he found that the captain had joined the leading infantry units. They were unable to advance due to a single German tank concealed in a field beside the road. The captain had Seaborne contact Belfast on his radio, and prepare to give coordinates to the cruiser to blast the tank, but the infantry commander asked him not to call in naval shells because his men were too close to the tank. Seaborne's captain suggested falling back 100 meters, but the infantry leader refused to do that either. "It's no use just keeping up with the troops," the captain commented to Seaborne. "If we are to do anything useful, we must be ahead. Then we can bring Belfast into play without risk to our side." The team set off for Croy, with the infantry staying in place, neither attacking the tank nor backing off from it. They reached the village, about 7 kilometres inland, around midday. There was no opposition, although 8 soldiers in German uniforms surrendered to the team. 5 were Russians, while 3, who hotly denied being Russian, were Lithuanians who hated the Russians as much as the Germans. The British sent them packing toward the beach. Seaborne's team pushed on and, at 3 p.m., reached the N13 at the village of Es-Lay, midway between Bayeux and Quay. Here they cautiously crossed the road and entered a cluster of houses beyond. They found a rustic setting, a village green, a cafe, a tall tree in the middle of the green, and 2 or 3 benches on the grass. Everything was very quiet and still. "Who said there was a war on?" Seaborne remarked. It was very pleasant, but not what they had come for. The captain decided to climb the tree to spy out the land. Suddenly, below them, they heard a rumble. Looking down, they saw a German half-track enter the square and park beneath their tree. 6 German soldiers climbed out, relieved themselves against the tree, then climbed back in. They hoped this was the only reason for the stop, but to their dismay, the half-track did not move. 10 minutes later, another half-track lumbered into the square, quickly followed by a third. The captain whispered to Seaborne, "Send a signal to Belfast. Send cut off in DYC code." The telegraphist went white. "Don't be daft," he whispered furiously. "What good will that do? Jerry will hear the Morse key for sure." The captain hissed back, "This is mutiny in the face of the enemy. I'll have you shot." "Shut up or you'll get us all shot," the telegraphist fired back. Seaborne made his own decision and sent no message. The Germans sorted themselves out. Half took off in one half-track headed east, while the other half jumped into a second half-track to head west, leaving the third vehicle unattended in the square. The telegraphist scurried down the tree trunk with Seaborne right beside him. They crossed wires, started the half-track, and drove off. The captain scrambled aboard as the vehicle moved out, shouting curses at the telegraphist and Seaborne. They charged back over the N13 and down the lane toward Croy. Near this village, they stopped and got out. Seaborne reported back to Belfast, and soon after they made contact once more with their own troops. Seaborne's small party was the only British unit from Gold Beach to cross the N13 that day. They had made the deepest penetration of any Allied unit, but had not accomplished anything positive, and ended up settling down for the night in Croy. The 47th Royal Marine Commandos landed at Item Sector on the far right, near Saint-Côme-des-Frères. Beach obstacles played havoc with their landing craft. 15 out of 16 were damaged initially. Machine gun fire was heavy. One Marine called out to his mates, "Perhaps we're intruding. This seems to be a private beach." But the Germans from the 352nd Division soon withdrew, and once ashore, the Royal Marines found it relatively tame, like another exercise back home. The medical teams had so little to do that they began unloading ammunition. The Marines' task was to push inland, turn right, pass to the south of Arimony and Long, and take Port Ouessant from the rear. Port Ouessant was midway between Omaha and Gold. The Marines were supposed to link up with the Americans at the tiny port, but neither the Marines nor the Americans reached Port Ouessant before nightfall. However, the Marines did get within a kilometre of it and took the port the next day. In their trek west, the Marines passed Long SU on the steep cliff on the outskirts of the village. The Germans had a superbly built large observation post linked by underground telephone lines to a battery of 4 155 mm cannons about a kilometre back from the cliff. The observation post had 2 floors. The bottom floor, mainly below ground, had a direction finder room, a long narrow aperture, a chart room, a telephone exchange, and other equipment. The upper floor was protected by a concrete slab more than a metre thick, reinforced by steel rods and supported by steel bars. It housed a rangefinder. The guns were in 4 separate fortifications, also with metre-thick reinforced concrete and underground magazines. This was the battery whose exact coordinates the British had obtained thanks to the blind son of the farmer who owned the land, and thanks to André Hind's radio reports over his homemade wireless set. Shortly after dawn, the battery, which had been pounded by tons of bombs from the air and shells from the sea in the pre-invasion bombardment, was the bombardment that hardly scratched the battleship Arkansas, which opened fire on the battleship Arkansas, anchored 5 kilometres off Omaha Beach. Arkansas returned fire, supported by 2 French cruisers. The battery then turned its cannons toward HMS Buolo, the headquarters ship for Gold Beach, which was about 12 kilometres out in the channel. The firing was accurate enough to force Buolo to change its position. At this point, HMS Ajax, famous for its participation against the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee off Montevideo on the River Plate on December 13, 1939, engaged in a ship versus fortification duel with the Long Swara battery. Ajax was about 11 kilometres offshore, but its firing was so accurate that within 20 minutes 2 of the German cannons fell silent. They had not been destroyed, but the shock and concussion from direct hits on the concrete emplacement shattered the German artillerymen, causing them to abandon the position. On a third emplacement, Ajax scored what was either the most accurate or the luckiest hit of the invasion, perhaps both. There were no survivors, so there is no way to know exactly what happened. However, the on-site evidence 5 decades later indicates what must have occurred. The entire breech mechanism of the 155mm cannon was gone, and the barrel, 3 inches thick steel, lay in pieces. The emplacement looked as if a tactical nuclear weapon had gone off inside. Evidently, Ajax sent one of its 6-inch shells through the embrasure of the emplacement at a moment when the breech was open and the gunners were loading a shell into it. The shell must have exploded in the breech at that same instant. The steel door leading to the magazine below must have been open. The fire from the explosion ran down into the magazine and set off the piles of 155mm ammunition stored there. What a bang that must have been! It tore off the concrete roof, scattering chunks of it all around. One has to doubt that even one piece of any of the gunners survived. 25 years later, the skipper of Ajax was entertaining a young American student studying in England. She was the daughter of an American woman he had been dating during the war and had just returned from a visit to Normandy. She got him talking about his duel with the battery at Longsu, and he described it. He said he had often wondered, but never found out how he had the exact coordinates of those well-camouflaged emplacements. The girl replied, "I know. I've just talked to André Heinz, then Professor of History at the University of Caen, and he told me." She then related the story of the blind boy and his father, pacing off the distances and getting the information to Heinz in Bayou Emissel. Gong was a resident of Saint-Nom-de-Frêne, where the Royal Marines landed on the evening of June 6th. She wrote in her diary, "What seemed impossible has really happened. The English have landed on the French coast, and our little village has become famous in a few hours. Not one civilian was killed or wounded. How can we express our surprise after such long years of waiting in wonderment and fear?" In the morning, she and a friend went to the edge of the cliff to see what was happening. What a sight met our eyes! As far as we could see, there were ships of all kinds and sizes, and above floated big balloons, silvery in the sun. Big bombers were passing and repassing in the sky as far as one could see, nothing but ships. Madame Jean returned to Saint-Nom, where she encountered British soldiers. The English had thought that all civilians had been evacuated from the coast, and were very surprised to find that the inhabitants had stayed in their homes. Our little church had received a direct hit on the roof, and fire broke out, but with the help of the villagers it was soon overcome. Guns were firing. What a noise everywhere, and the smell of burning. She wondered if she were dreaming. Is it all really true? She wrote, "We are at last liberated. The enormous strength that all this war material represents is fantastic, and the way it has been handled with such precision is marvellous. A group of Tommies passed and asked for water. They filled their bottles, said a few words, and, having given chocolate and sweets to the children, continued on their way. On the beach, Lieutenant Commander Winnie noted that as night came on, all was quiet. An eerie feeling remained. There was not a soul in sight. He went to a farmhouse that backed onto the pillbox that had given so much trouble at Le Hamil in the forenoon, and was surprised to hear a noise inside. He knocked on the door, and to his astonishment, an old lady appeared. She seemed quite unconcerned. She had apparently been there all day, carrying out her household chores as usual. By nightfall on June 6th, the British at Gold Beach had penetrated about 10 kilometres inland and linked up with the Canadians to their left. They were on the cliff looking down on Arimony. They had not taken Bayou or crossed the N13, but they were in position to do so the next day. They had put 25,000 men ashore at a cost of 400 casualties. It was a good start. On August 19, 1942, the 2nd Canadian Division, supported by British commandos and a small unit of American Rangers, made an amphibious assault on the port of Dieppe on the upper Normandy coast, about 100 kilometres from Le Havre. It was a raid, not an invasion, and it was poorly planned and badly executed. The Canadians suffered terrible losses. 3/4 of them were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner within 6 hours. All 7 battalion commanders were casualties. At Dieppe, the Germans had fortified positions with 88mm cannons on the cliffs on each side of the beach, along with machine gun pillboxes and entrenched troops. The beach consisted entirely of shingle, which was impossible for tanks to cross and difficult for men. There had been no pre-assault bombardment from ships or planes. The attacking infantry outnumbered the defenders by only a 2-to-1 ratio, and the defenders were top-quality troops. Allied propaganda tried to present Dieppe as a rehearsal from which critical lessons were learned, lessons applied on June 6, 1944. But in fact, the only lesson learned was not to attack fortified ports head-on. Dieppe was a national disaster. The Canadians owed the Germans some payback, which they got on Juno Beach. Coral-Sioux, in the centre of Juno Beach, was the most heavily defended point in the long stretch from Arromanches on the far right of the British beaches to Westerham on the far left. Saint-Ouen and Ihon, to the left-east of Coral, were also well defended. General R's 716th Division had 11 heavy batteries of 155 mm guns and 9 medium batteries, mainly 75s. All were supposed to be in fortified bunkers, but only 2 bunkers were complete. Elsewhere, the crews were protected by unroofed bunkers or earth and gun pits in open fields. The wider stand, Nesta at Vauquerel, Bernier and Saint-Aubin, were heavily fortified with reinforced concrete. The wider and Nesta were supported by trenches and gun pits surrounded by barbed wire and minefields. All weapons were sighted to fire along the beach in enfilade, not out to sea. The zones of fire were calculated to interlock on the formidable array of beach obstacles situated just below the high water mark. To the Germans, as John Keegan noted, the combination of fixed obstacles and enfilading fire from the resistance nests was deemed to guarantee the destruction of any landing force. But General R had some serious problems. His widest nesta were a kilometre apart, and his mobility was practically non-existent. The 716th used horses to move its artillery and supplies, while its men moved by foot. Their weapons were a hodgepodge of captured rifles and cannons, and the men were either under 18 or over 35 years of age, or veterans of the Eastern Front in their mid-20s who had suffered more or less disabling wounds. Their orders were to stand fast, giving an inch of ground was forbidden, and German NCOs were there to enforce those orders. The encircling minefields and barbed wire would keep them in just as much as it would keep the Canadians out. Man for man, they were hardly a match for the young, tough, magnificently trained Canadians, and they were outnumbered by the Canadians in the first wave at a ratio of 6-to-1, 2,400 Canadians to 400 Germans. The Canadian 3rd Division contained lumberjacks, fishermen, miners, farmers, tough outdoorsmen, all volunteers. Canada had conscription in World War II, but only volunteers were sent into combat zones. Sapper Josh Honan volunteered in a way familiar to all veterans. He was a surveyor in an engineer company in Canada. In late 1943, when a colonel called him to headquarters, he said, "You're Irish," the colonel declared. "Yes, sir," Honan replied. "An Irishman always likes a good scrap, doesn't he? We got a job we'd like you to do." Honan replied that he would just as soon stay with his company. "We're all together, sir. We're going overseas, and I don't want to get separated from my mates." "Never mind about all that. You may meet them again in England," the colonel said. "What is the job?" Honan asked. The colonel replied that he could not say. "The only thing I can tell you about it is that there are many men in England today who would gladly change places with you." "Just one will do," Honan responded. "Well, you Irish will have your little joke. I can promise you that you will be totally pleased that you took this job," the colonel said. "Will I?" "Oh, yes. I know you Irish. You enjoy a good scrap, don't you?" In his interview, Honan commented, "I wasn't too keen on this jolly good scrap business talk, but there it was." A few days later, he was on his way to England, where he discovered that the job was just about the worst imaginable. He was to precede the first wave and blow up beach obstacles. On the night crossing on his LST, Honan noted that the men he was with, from the Regina Rifle Regiment, headed toward Mike sector of Juneau, spent their time alternating between using their whetstones to sharpen knives, daggers, and bayonets, and playing poker. He saw one man who had a knife with a wooden haft covered with leatherwork and a big diamond-like gem inserted into it, sharpening it like mad. Others were playing poker like nothing he'd ever seen before. There was no use in holding back, nothing made any difference, bet the lot. When officers came around, they would sort of cover the money with the blankets they were playing on. Asked if the officers didn't try to stop the men from gambling, Honan said matter-of-factly, "You couldn't stop anybody from doing anything at that stage." Honan saw a single ship steaming through his convoy between the rows of ships, and as it passed, they could see on the prow the solitary piper silhouetted against the evening sky and the thin lament coming across. We thought, we might not come back again. It was very touching, and everybody was hushed and just stood there watching. Not a sound from anyone, and then gradually it passed by and faded away in the distance, and we often thought that we might not come back again. The Canadians were scheduled to land at 7:45 a.m., but rough seas made them 10 minutes or more late and extremely seasick. "Death would be better than this," Private Gerald Henry of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles moaned to one of his mates. They had been told in the final briefings that all the pillboxes, machine guns, and artillery pieces would be kaput as a result of the air and naval bombardments, but things did not work out that way. The midnight June 5th air bombardment by RAF Bomber Command was heavy enough. The 5,268 tons of bombs dropped was the heaviest raid the British had yet mounted in the war, but it was woefully inaccurate. American B-17S came over at first light, but as at Omaha, they delayed dropping their bombs up to 30 seconds after crossing the aiming point. As a result, the bombs fell well inland. Very few of the fortifications were hit, none on Juneau. Royal Navy cruisers and battleships began firing at 6 a.m. The destroyers went into action at 6:19 a.m. At 7:10 a.m., the tanks and 25-pounders on LCTs joined in, followed by the rockets from the LCT. It was the heaviest bombardment ever fired from ship to shore, but the smoke and haze were such that very few of the shells actually hit their targets. A target analysis team later calculated that only about 14% of the bunkers were destroyed. The smoke was so thick that for the most part, the German defenders could not see out to sea. At 6:45 a.m., the 7th Army's routine morning report to OB West read, "Purpose of naval bombardment not yet apparent. It appears to be a covering action in conjunction with attacks to be made at other points later." Occasionally the wind would sweep away the smoke. When it did, the Germans could see countless ships, big and small, beyond comprehension. The bombardment lifted at 7:30 a.m., when the first wave was supposed to be landing. This gave the Germans time to recover and man their guns. All the softening up did was alert the enemy of the landing. Private Henry remarked that the bombardment had failed to kill a single German or silence one weapon. As the Canadian landing craft approached the beach, obstacles, mostly underwater due to the strong northwest wind, there was an eerie silence. The Germans were not firing, which the Canadians found encouraging. They did not yet realize that the reason was all the German guns were sighted to fire down the beach. Josh Honan was on an LST waiting to be offloaded onto an LCA for the final run of 5 kilometers or so to the beach. One of his mates asked, "Do you think this might just be a rehearsal? It looks a bit elaborate for that." Honan replied. Honan had his own fantasy that his demolition team would be forgotten by the officer in charge. "It was like being called for the dentist," Honan said. "I was hoping that I wouldn't be next, that maybe somebody else would go before me." But then this fellow with the bullhorn called out, "Sapper Assault Team, report to your boat stations on number 6 deck now." Safely loaded, Honan's LCA joined 5 others and began to circle. He went to the ramp to watch the action. He noted that all the Canadian soldiers had deeply suntanned faces, while the British swains and crews were moon-white. He looked for landmarks, but could not see any through the smoke. The LCA was pitching and bucking in the waves. The rougher it got, the less I looked around me to see what was happening to anybody else. The craft started closing up on each other, but not in an organized fashion. The LCAs began losing way and steerage, bumping into each other and into beach obstacles. When the leading craft, mostly carrying engineers and UDT teams, reached the outer line of obstacles, a quarter or more of them set off T-mines. The mines were not big enough to blow the craft out of the water or otherwise destroy them. The open tops allowed most of the explosive power to escape into the air, but they made holes in the bottoms or damaged the ramps. Honan's LCA came in opposite Bernier-Sous. Honan tried to give the coxswain directions to avoid obstacles, but he hadn't enough steerage for the boat to respond, so they finished up by running on top of one of the obstacles with the ramp up against it. They could see the mine just beside them. "One bump and bang," so Major Stone, Honan's CO, said, "I'm going over." I said, "Bloody good luck to you." But my orders were to try to keep Stoney alive, so I had to go over after him. Honan dumped all his equipment overboard, rifle, explosives, walkie-talkie, the works, and dove into the water after his major. Stoney was starting to swim for the front of the boat, and Honan said, "Bugger it, I've got to do that too." So he swam to the front. The obstacle was wired onto 2 adjacent tetrahedrons, and the major had cutting pliers. He said, "I'll cut the wires," and I said, "Okay, I'll take out the detonators." So he got around the tetrahedron, wrapped his legs around it, and started to unscrew the detonators. Stoney shouted to get 12 men off the craft, and for the others to go to the stern to help lift the prow off the obstacle. 12 soldiers dove in. We all got our shoulders to the prow and pushed. It was about 8 a.m. The leading LCA carrying assault teams were dropping their ramps. Canadians were making their way on foot through the obstacles up onto the beach. The Germans commenced firing. Snipers and mortar crews were aiming at the landing craft, while machine guns concentrated on the first wave of infantry. Bullets were creating miniature geysers around Honan. Major Stone and the men managed to free the LCA. Its ramp went down, and the infantry made toward shore. As Honan moved to the next obstacle to remove the detonator on its mine, my mates were attacking the pillboxes. That was their business, and I was doing mine. I was a sitting duck. I didn't have anything to work with except my bare hands. The rising tide covered the obstacles faster than Honan could unscrew the detonators. Honan remarked that he could do his job only by wrapping his legs around the obstacles to keep from being floated away, and he could only use one hand. At about 8:15 a.m. he decided, "Bugger this, I'm going ashore." He swam for the shore. There he saw a headless corpse. The man had apparently been wounded in the water and then run over by an LCA. The propeller had cut his head off. He was clutching in his hand a knife with a diamond-like gem inserted into the leather wrapped around the handle that Honan had noticed during the night. When Honan reached the seawall, a couple of the chaps hauled him up and over. One of them pulled out a flask of whiskey and offered Honan a drink. "No thanks," Honan said. The soldier took a slug himself and asked, "Why not? You're not an FNT total, are you?" "I'm not," Honan replied, "but I'm afraid that stuff will make me feel brave or some bloody thing like that." Honan moved into the village, where he took shelter until the German machine gun fire was suppressed. "I had done my bit," he explained. "I was watching the others get on with it until the tide receded." He could do no more demolition of obstacles. Soon the guns fell silent, and the people began coming out into the street, waving for the liberators and throwing bouquets of roses. The village priest appeared. "Monsieur le Honan," said Honan in his best high school French, "I hope that you are pleased that we have arrived." "Yes," the priest replied, "but I will be better pleased when you are gone again," as he pointed sadly to the hole in the top of his 17th century church. The barber came out and asked Honan if he would like a cognac. "No," Honan replied, "but I could do with a shave." The barber was happy to comply. So I went in and sat in the chair in my wringing wet battle dress, the water squelching in my shoes, and he gave me a shave. Refreshed and rested, Honan returned to the beach to go back to work. I was in time to see the DD tanks coming ashore. 2 of them came out of the water. I had never seen nor heard of them before, so this was like sea monsters coming out of the deep. Those 2 tanks pulled up their skirts and ducked around the village with the other girls. Sergeant Ronald Johnston was a tank driver. At 5 a.m., out in the channel in the anchoring area, he offloaded from an LST onto a rhino ferry, an experience he found disconcerting as he had not done the manoeuvre previously. The steel tracks slipped on the steel deck of the rhino, and his tank almost plunged into the sea. Finally, he got to his designated position. There was a jeep in front of him. Johnston walked up to the jeep driver and asked, "That jeep is waterproof, isn't it?" "Yeah, why?" "I sure as hell hope so, because if it stalls, I'm going right over the top of it." When the ferry made the shoreline, Johnston recalled, the jeep driver almost broke his neck looking back to make sure the Sherman tank wasn't coming. The jeep made it okay. Johnston was right behind. He was horrified when he made the shore and discovered he had to run over dead and wounded infantry. "We just had to put it out of our minds," he commented. "Just forget it. There was only one way forward." Johnston's tank carried 2 motorcycles strapped onto the exhaust pipes and was towing an ammunition trailer. Cordite was wrapped around the waterproofing and exhaust pipes, all connected by wire. When the motorcycles were removed, Johnston got the word from the tank commander to hit the button that ignited the cordite and blew the waterproofing off. It made a hell of an explosion on the beach. It was unreal, machine gun fire, mostly wild. A lot of the infantry was still in the water, and they couldn't get in. They took cover behind the tanks. A commando officer told Johnston to turn left. I looked and I said, "Oh my God, no!" The commando asked, "Why not?" Johnston replied, "I'm not going to run over any more of my own buddies today." Sergeant Tom Plum was with a mortar platoon of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. He went in on an LCT. When the ramp dropped and the tanks drove off, the LCT was pushed back into deeper water. The skipper nevertheless ordered the sergeant in charge of the first section to drive off in his mortar carrier. The sergeant protested that the water was too deep, but the skipper was adamant. The first carrier drove off and immediately sank in 4 meters of water. The men came floating up, choking and cursing. The skipper ordered the next carrier off, but the sergeant rebelled and demanded a dry landing. The skipper threatened him with a court-martial, but the sergeant held fast. Finally, the skipper conceded, raised the ramp, circled, came in again, and Plum and the others made a dry landing. That landing craft commanding officer was later given a dishonourable discharge. Plum commented with some satisfaction, The skipper had reason to be hesitant, reason to want to pull that famous naval maneuver known as getting the hell out of there. All around him, all across Juno Beach, landing craft were setting off T-mines. Many did so coming in, more did so when their troops and vehicles disembarked because they then floated higher in the water, and wave action pushed them against mined obstacles. Half or more of the craft at Juno were damaged, a quarter sunk. Sergeant C.G. Johnson of the Regina Rifles was first out of his LCA. It had stuck on a sandbank. When Johnson took a couple of steps forward, he was in over his head. Then a swell came along, and it lifted the boat and went right over the top of me. He paused in his interview, shook his head, and said with wonder in his voice, "And I'm still here telling about it." One of his mates was hit in the stomach and legs. Despite his wounds, he went straight for a pillbox. He shot one of the gunners and got his hands around the throat of the other. He strangled the German, then he died himself. When we found him, he still had his hands around the German's throat. A DD tank swam ashore, dropped the skirts, and began blasting with its 75mm cannon. Unfortunately, the tank had blasted at some Canadian infantry. Johnson got over to the tank and was able to get the captain to cease fire. Asked how friendly fire could have happened, Johnson replied, "That tank was one of the first ones in, and they saw troops. I guess everybody's uniform was black from being wet anyway, and they just started firing." Johnson pointed to a 37mm gun in front of a building and got the tanker to blast it for the infantry assault teams. And it was a matter of chance whether they landed on their sector before any tanks got ashore, landed side by side with tanks, or followed tanks ashore. In general, the DD tanks were late if they arrived at all, while skippers of LCTs who decided to hell with the orders and went all the way in put their tanks in, even as the UDT men started working on the obstacles. It was also a matter of chance whether the infantry landed dry or in deep water. Sergeant McQuaid, an Irishman, jumped off his ramp into neck-deep water. Amid many other curses, he shouted, "Oh, the evil of it! They're trying to drown me before I even get up on the beach!" The Germans opened fire as the infantry made their way through the obstacles up to the seawall. The Canadians in the first wave took dreadful casualties. In some companies, it was every bit as bad as the first wave at Omaha. B Company of the Winnipeg was cut down to 1 officer and 25 men before it reached the seawall. D Company of the Regina Rifles lost half its strength even before it reached the beach. The regimental historian described the scene. A company found the bombardment had not cracked the huge casemate on their sector. This fortress had reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick and housed an 88mm gun as well as machine guns. In addition, there were concrete trenches outside the fort, liberally sprinkled with small arms posts. Men survived by getting behind tanks until they could reach the seawall.